The story of Islamic Caliphates is often told as a golden age of science, culture, and expansion. History books celebrate the towering achievements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and architecture. Yet, beneath the celebrated veneer lies a darker, less discussed reality, one marked by systematic cruelty, cultural destruction, and human suffering on an unprecedented scale. What happened to the millions who refused to convert during the rapid expansion of Islamic empires? What were the true costs of conquest beyond the battlefield? This is a story rarely told, but one that is crucial to understanding the full impact of Islamic Caliphate expansion. When the Islamic Caliphates expanded across vast territories, from the Middle East and North Africa, Persia, the Balkans, and parts of India, they did not simply conquer lands. They conquered peoples, cultures, and entire ways of life. Unlike many other empires, the Islamic Caliphates perfected methods of domination that went far beyond military victory. They understood that breaking the spirit of conquered peoples was more effective than merely occupying their lands. This meant systematic policies designed to erase identities, destroy cultures, and enforce submission through fear, economic oppression, and psychological manipulation. One of the most infamous and brutal practices was the Ottoman Empire's Devshirme system, often called the blood tax. This was not a random act of cruelty, but a calculated, institutionalized policy of child trafficking disguised as tax collection. Christian families in the Balkans were forced to surrender their sons, typically between the ages of 8 and 18, to Ottoman officials. These boys were selected based on physical strength and intelligence, forcibly taken from their homes, and transported to Istanbul. Parents were made to watch their children being taken away, knowing they would never see them again. Resistance was met with the death of the entire family. Once in Ottoman hands, these boys were subjected to a brutal process of forced conversion to Islam and intensive military training designed to erase their previous identities. They were forbidden from speaking their native languages, contacting their families, or practicing their original religions. The most promising were trained as janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry corps, a force that became the backbone of Ottoman military power. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and cruel. Boys were taught that their Christian families had abandoned them, while the Sultan had saved them from ignorance. They were given new names, new histories, and new loyalties. Many genuinely believed they owed everything to the system that had enslaved them. The scale of this operation was staggering. Between 1365 and 1826, when the system was finally abolished, an estimated 500,000 to 1 million Christian boys were taken from their families. Entire regions of the Balkans lived in constant terror of the next collection. The cruel irony was that these stolen children became the primary force used to conquer more Christian lands. Former Christians were used to destroy Christian communities, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of conquest and conversion. The Devshirme was not just about creating soldiers. It was about breaking the spirit of entire communities, ensuring that resistance was both practically and psychologically impossible. Families developed desperate strategies to protect their children. Some deliberately injured their sons to make them unsuitable for selection. Others hid them in remote areas during collection periods. But the Ottoman system was thorough, and few children escaped once identified. This practice was a form of psychological warfare that left deep scars on the social fabric of the Balkans, effects of which linger to this day. The cruelty of the Islamic Caliphates extended far beyond the Balkans. The Islamic slave trade, which lasted over 1,400 years from the 7th century until the early 20th century, was one of the largest and most brutal in history. Conservative estimates suggest that between 11 and 17 million Africans were enslaved and transported to Islamic lands, but the true number was likely much higher. Unlike the Atlantic slave trade, the Islamic slave trade was marked by systematic castration of male slaves. Between 80 and 90% of male slaves destined for Islamic markets were castrated either before transport or upon arrival, a procedure with a mortality rate of approximately 90%, effectively a death sentence. These castration centers were industrial-scale operations, with the main center in Aswan, Egypt, processing thousands of boys and men annually. Those who survived became eunuchs, forever marked as less than human and incapable of reproduction. This was not accidental, but deliberate policy. Islamic law permitted slavery, but encouraged the freeing of slaves, especially those who converted to Islam. by preventing slaves from reproducing. Islamic societies ensured a constant demand for new captives while avoiding the complications of a large permanent slave population. Female slaves faced a different but equally brutal fate. The most attractive were selected for harems and concubinage, while others were used for domestic labor. Unlike in the Americas, where slave families could form and reproduce, Islamic slavery was designed to prevent the development of slave communities. The Mamluk system took this to an extreme. Young boys, primarily from the Caucasus and Central Asia, were purchased as slaves, converted to Islam, and trained as elite warriors. These Mamluks eventually became so powerful they overthrew their masters and ruled Egypt and Syria for over 250 years. Yet, they maintained the system, continuously importing new slave soldiers rather than allowing their own children to inherit power. The economic impact of these practices was devastating for source regions. Conquest, revealing how these empires maintained control not just through force, but through the destruction of identity itself. Entire areas of Africa were depopulated by slave raids. Constant warfare to capture slaves destroyed local economies and prevented development. Some regions never recovered from centuries of systematic human trafficking. Arab chroniclers like al-Baladuri and Ibn Battuta wrote matter-of-factly about slave markets and castration procedures, treating them as normal aspects of economic life. The scale and systematic nature of these operations were considered unremarkable by contemporary Islamic writers. The psychological impact on families and communities was profound. Islamic Caliphates developed sophisticated systems for destroying other religions while maintaining plausible deniability about forced conversion. The Dhimma system created legal frameworks that made non-conversion economically and socially unsustainable. The jizya, or poll tax on non-Muslims, was deliberately set at levels that would bankrupt most families. In many regions, the tax was equivalent to several months' income, making it impossible for all but the wealthiest pay. The collection process was humiliating, with dhimmis often forced to present themselves publicly, sometimes being struck or forced to kneel while paying. But taxation was just one tool. The systematic destruction of religious infrastructure was equally important. When Arabs conquered Egypt in 641 AD, they began a centuries-long campaign of destroying Coptic monasteries and churches. These were not just religious buildings, but centers of learning that contained the last remnants of ancient Egyptian knowledge and culture. The conquest of Persia saw similar destruction. Zoroastrian fire temples, some of which had burned continuously for over 1,000 years, were systematically extinguished. Zoroastrian texts were burned, and priests were executed or forced to convert. Within a few centuries, a religion that had dominated the Persian Empire for over a millennium was reduced to a tiny minority. Mahmud of Ghazna's campaigns in India between 1000 and 1027 AD represent perhaps the most systematic religious destruction in history. His chroniclers boasted that he destroyed over 50,000 Hindu temples and forced millions to convert at sore point. The famous Somnath Temple, one of Hinduism's holiest sites, was demolished, and its fragments used to build steps for a mosque. This destruction was not random vandalism, but calculated psychological warfare. By destroying the physical symbols of other religions, Islamic conquerors demonstrated the powerlessness of other gods and the supremacy of Islam. Forced conversions often took place in the ruins of destroyed temples, reinforcing the message of Islamic dominance. Legal restrictions made practicing other religions increasingly difficult. Christians and Jews were forbidden from building new churches or synagogues, ringing bells, or conducting public processions. They could not testify against Muslims in court, carry weapons, or ride horses. These restrictions created a system of legal apartheid that made non-Muslim second-class citizens in their own lands. The cumulative effect was devastating. Ancient Christian communities in North Africa, which had produced theologians like Augustine, disappeared entirely. The Zoroastrian population of Persia, once numbering in the millions, was reduced to fewer than 200,000 worldwide today. Entire religious traditions that had existed for millennia were erased from their homelands. This is just the beginning of the story. The cruelty of the Islamic Caliphates extended into every aspect of conquered people's lives, from economic exploitation to cultural genocide. The next section will explore the institutionalized sexual slavery, economic warfare, and the systematic erasure of cultures that followed. The cruelty of the Islamic Caliphates did not stop at the battlefield or the forced conscription of children. It extended deeply into the personal and social fabric of conquered peoples, particularly through the institutionalization of sexual slavery. This was not a side effect of war, but a deliberate, systematic method of domination designed to break conquered communities by exploiting their women. The harem system, often romanticized or misunderstood in popular culture, was in reality a brutal institution of sexual exploitation and control. The Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, famously celebrated in the Arabian Nights, maintained a harem of over 2,000 women. These women were captured from across the Islamic world and kept as sexual property, discarded when they aged or fell out of favor. The harem was not merely a symbol of wealth or power. It was a tool of psychological warfare. The presence of these enslaved women served as a constant reminder to conquered peoples of their subjugation and the absolute power of their rulers. When Baghdad fell to the Mongols in 1258, the last Abbasid caliph's harem contained over 700 women. Contemporary accounts describe the systematic rape and murder of these women as the city burned, marking the violent end of centuries of institutionalized sexual slavery in the Abbasid capital. The concubinage system created a legal framework that stripped these women of all rights. Concubines could be bought, sold, or given away like any other property. Their children were considered illegitimate and had no inheritance rights unless specifically acknowledged by their fathers. Slave markets throughout the Islamic world specialized in the sale of women for sexual purposes. Ibn Battuta, the famous traveler and chronicler, described markets in Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad where women were displayed naked for inspection by potential buyers. The most attractive women commanded prices equivalent to several years' wages for skilled workers. This commodification of women was a deeply dehumanizing process that tore apart families and communities. The psychological impact on families was devastating. Parents lived in constant fear that their daughters, especially the most beautiful, would be captured and sold into sexual slavery. Some families resorted to desperate measures, deliberately scarring their daughters' faces to make them less desirable to slave raiders. Others kept their daughters hidden indoors, creating a culture of female seclusion that persists in some regions to this day. This system created a relentless demand for new captives. Unlike wives, who retained their status throughout their lives, concubines were frequently replaced as they aged, meaning slave raids specifically targeted young women. This had profound demographic impact, devastating the population structure of conquered regions. The scale of sexual slavery under the Ottoman Empire alone is estimated to have involved the enslavement of over 1 to 1.5 million women for sexual purposes between the 14th and 19th centuries. These women came from the Balkans, the Caucasus, Africa, and Central Asia, representing dozens of different cultures and ethnicities. Islamic law provided religious justification for these practices. Quranic verses about those whom your right hand possesses were interpreted to permit unlimited sexual access to female slaves. Religious scholars developed elaborate legal frameworks regulating the buying, selling, and use of sex slaves while maintaining that the system was divinely sanctioned. The impact on conquered communities was profound and long-lasting. The systematic removal of young women disrupted family formation and cultural transmission. Many communities never recovered from the demographic damage caused by centuries of sexual slavery. This was not merely a byproduct of conquest, but a calculated strategy to weaken and control populations by destroying their social and familial bonds. Economic warfare was another critical tool used by Islamic Caliphates to maintain control over conquered peoples. The goal was not just to extract wealth, but to systematically destroy the economic capacity of these regions, forcing dependence on Islamic rulers. The jizya tax imposed on non-Muslims was deliberately set at confiscatory levels. In many areas, it consumed 50 to 80% of agricultural output, leaving farmers barely enough to survive. When farmers failed to pay, their land was confiscated and redistributed to Muslim settlers or converted into waqf, religious endowment properties that were exempt from taxation. The Umayyad conquest of Persia provides a clear example of this economic destruction. The sophisticated Sasanian irrigation systems, which had supported Persian agriculture for centuries, were deliberately destroyed or allowed to decay. This was not accidental neglect, but a calculated policy designed to prevent economic recovery and force dependence on Arab rulers. Tribute demands often included quotas of people rather than just goods. The Nubians, for example, were required to provide 400 slaves annually to the Fatimid Caliphate. The Bulgars had to supply young men for military service. These human tributes devastated local populations while providing the caliphates with a steady supply of forced labor. Acknowledging these truths, can we learn from them and work toward a future that respects cultural diversity and human dignity? Trade restrictions further entrenched economic apartheid. Non-Muslims were often prohibited from engaging in certain types of commerce or forced to pay additional taxes on their business activities. This gradually transferred economic control to Muslim merchants and impoverished non-Muslim communities. Regions that had been prosperous for centuries became economic backwaters within a few generations of Islamic conquest. The goal was clear: make resistance economically impossible while creating incentives for conversion to Islam. Cultural genocide was a final and perhaps most devastating aspect of Islamic conquest. The caliphates did not merely conquer territories. They systematically erased the cultures and identities of conquered peoples. This destruction was so thorough that entire civilizations vanished from historical memory. Libraries and centers of learning were deliberately destroyed. When Arabs conquered Alexandria, they destroyed what remained of the famous library that had been the intellectual center of the ancient world. Similar destruction occurred in Ctesiphon, the Sasanian capital, where Persian royal libraries containing centuries of accumulated knowledge were burned. Language oppression was a key tool of cultural destruction. Arabic was imposed as a language of administration, education, and religion throughout conquered territories. Local languages were marginalized and eventually forgotten. Coptic, the last form of ancient Egyptian, survived only in religious contexts before disappearing entirely from daily use. The renaming of cities, regions, and geographical features was part of a systematic effort to erase pre-Islamic history. Ancient names with thousands of years of history were replaced with Arabic alternatives. This was not just administrative convenience, but deliberate historical erasure. Religious festivals and cultural practices were systematically suppressed. The Persian New Year celebration of Nowruz was banned in many regions. Hindu festivals were prohibited in conquered Indian territories. Local customs that had defined communities for centuries were declared un-Islamic and eliminated. The destruction of monuments and architectural heritage was equally systematic. Pre-Islamic temples, palaces, and monuments were demolished or converted into mosques. The message was clear: the past was worthless, and only Islamic culture had value. Educational systems were completely restructured. Traditional schools that had transmitted local knowledge and culture for generations were closed or converted into madrasas that taught only Islamic subjects. This broke the chain of cultural transmission and ensured that younger generations grew up ignorant of their heritage. The results were devastating and permanent. Ancient Egyptian civilization, which had survived Persian, Greek, and Roman conquests while maintaining its essential character, was completely erased within a few centuries of Arab conquest. Zoroastrian Persia, with its rich literary and philosophical traditions, was reduced to a shadow of its former self. The scale of cultural destruction was so complete that we are still discovering what was lost. Archaeological excavations regularly uncover evidence of sophisticated civilizations that were systematically destroyed and forgotten. Entire chapters of human history were erased by Islamic conquest. The Islamic Caliphate created one of history's most efficient systems of conquest and cultural destruction. Their methods were so effective that entire civilizations simply vanished from historical memory, leaving behind only archaeological fragments and scattered references in surviving texts. The scale of destruction was unprecedented. Millions of people were enslaved, killed, or forced to abandon their cultures and identities. Ancient civilizations that had survived multiple conquests and invasions were completely erased within a few centuries of Islamic expansion. The systematic nature of these practices reveals that they were not random acts of violence or cultural misunderstanding. They were calculated policies designed to break the spirit of conquered peoples and ensure that resistance would be impossible. The combination of military conquest, economic warfare, cultural destruction, and systematic enslavement created a system of domination that reshaped the medieval world. Understanding these historical practices helps us recognize patterns of cultural destruction that continue today. The methods may change, but the goal remains the same: the complete erasure of alternative ways of life and the imposition of a single dominant culture. This history challenges the often romanticized narrative of the Islamic Golden Age by revealing the human cost behind the empire's expansion. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about conquest, power, and cultural survival. The legacy of these actions is still felt in the regions affected, where the scars of forced conversion, slavery, and cultural erasure remain visible in social and political tensions. As we move forward, it is essential to remember that history is complex and multifaceted. Recognizing the darker chapters of the past does not diminish the achievements of any civilization, but provides a fuller, more honest understanding of human history. Only by the legacy of the Islamic Caliphate's conquests is a story of profound transformation, but also profound loss. The final chapter in this history is the enduring impact these policies had on the social, cultural, and political landscapes of the conquered regions. The systematic destruction of identities, the forced assimilation, and the economic and demographic upheavals created ripple effects that shaped centuries of history and continue to influence the modern world. One of the most insidious aspects of Islamic conquest was the deliberate suppression of alternative religious and cultural identities. The dhimma system, which imposed legal and social restrictions on non-Muslims, created a form of institutionalized second-class citizenship. Non-Muslims were subjected to humiliating taxes, barred from certain professions, and denied basic rights such as testifying in court against Muslims or bearing arms. This legal apartheid was designed to pressure non-Muslims into conversion or exile, effectively erasing religious minorities from the public sphere. The psychological toll of this system was immense. Communities that had thrived for centuries found themselves marginalized, their traditions outlawed or ridiculed. The destruction of religious sites was not merely physical but symbolic, aimed at breaking the will of entire peoples. When a temple, church, or synagogue was destroyed or converted into a mosque, it sent a clear message: your God are powerless, your culture is inferior, and your future lies only in submission. This cultural erasure was compounded by the imposition of Arabic as a dominant language. Language is a vessel of culture, history, and identity. By replacing local languages with Arabic in administration, education, and religion, the caliphates effectively severed the transmission of indigenous knowledge and traditions. Over time, this led to the disappearance of entire languages and dialects, along with the unique worldviews they carried. The renaming of cities and geographical features further erased the memory of pre-Islamic civilizations. Ancient names with millennia of history were replaced with Arabic ones, rewriting maps and histories to reflect the new order. This was not a mere bureaucratic change, but a deliberate act of historical revisionism designed to legitimize Islamic rule and delegitimize the past. Economically, the impact was equally devastating. The confiscatory taxes and land seizures impoverished local populations and disrupted traditional agricultural and trade systems. The destruction or neglect of irrigation and infrastructure crippled economies that had once been prosperous and self-sustaining. The forced supply of slaves and soldiers drained communities of their young and able-bodied, further weakening their capacity to resist or recover. The demographic consequences of these policies were profound. The removal of young men through the Devshirme system and slave raids, combined with the targeting of young women for sexual slavery, created demographic imbalances that affected population growth and social structures. Families were torn apart, and the social fabric of communities was irreparably damaged. Despite these devastating effects, some conquered peoples found ways to resist and preserve their identities. Secret religious practices, hidden languages, and underground cultural traditions persisted in many regions. However, these were often fragile and vulnerable to further repression. The long-term survival of these communities depended on their ability to adapt and sometimes assimilate, often at great cost to their heritage. The Mamluk system in Egypt and Syria offers a complex example of this dynamic. Originally slave soldiers imported from the Caucasus and Central Asia, the Mamluks rose to power and ruled for over 2 centuries. Yet, they maintained a system of slave soldier recruitment rather than establishing hereditary rule. This ensured a continuous influx of new slaves and prevented the formation of a stable, native ruling class. The Mamluks' rule was marked by both military strength and the continuation of the very system that had enslaved them, illustrating the paradoxes of power and identity in Islamic empires. The long duration of Islamic slavery and conquest, spanning over a millennium, meant that its effects were deeply embedded in the social and cultural fabric of vast regions. The legacy of these policies is visible today in the ethnic, religious, and cultural compositions of the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia. The scars of forced conversion, slavery, and cultural suppression have contributed to ongoing conflicts and tensions. Understanding this history is essential not only for a fuller picture of the past, but also for recognizing patterns of cultural domination and erasure that persist in various forms today. The methods of conquest may have evolved, but the goal of imposing a dominant culture and suppressing alternatives remains a recurring theme in human history. The story of the Islamic Caliphate's conquest challenges simplistic narratives of cultural flourishing and empire building. It reveals a darker side of history marked by systematic cruelty, cultural genocide, and human suffering. This history demands a nuanced understanding that acknowledges both achievements and atrocities. By confronting these uncomfortable truths, we honor the memories of those who suffered and ensure that history is not sanitized or forgotten. It also serves as a warning against the dangers of cultural imperialism and erasure diversity. The preservation of cultural heritage and respect for human dignity must remain central to how we understand and engage with history. In conclusion, the cruelest things Islamic caliphates did to conquered peoples were not isolated acts of violence, but part of a calculated system of domination. From the forced conscription of children and the horrors of the slave trade to the destruction of religious and cultural institutions, these policies were designed to break the spirit of entire peoples and erase their identities. The legacy of these actions is a testament to the resilience of human cultures, but also a reminder of the devastating costs of conquest. As we reflect on this history, it is crucial to approach it with honesty and empathy, recognizing the complexity of human societies and the consequences of power. Only through such understanding can we hope to build a future that respects cultural diversity and human rights, learning from the past to avoid repeating its darkest chapters.